Hello, and welcome to Ask Me Anything on Ransomware Prevention and Recovery. Today's webinar is sponsored by Rubrik and Stratascale and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this chat. We've got two ransomware rock stars today. They're CISOs from Rubrik and Stratascale, and they're ideal people to address all your questions about ransomware. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Now, before we get to today's great content, I do want to go through a few housekeeping items that'll help you get the most out of the event today. So this is an Ask Me Anything type session. So the most important part of the console today is the Q&A window. Just type your questions about ransomware, ransomware prevention, ransomware recovery, right there in the questions console, and we'll get to as many as we can during the hour. That Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues that you might be experiencing. A browser refresh will fix most of your audio, video, slide advancement issues, but if it doesn't work, just let us know in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Next, I'd like to call your attention to the handout section of your console. We've got an especially rich set of resources in there, a bunch of PDFs from Rubrik, a PDF from Stratascale, as well as some links to Actual Tech Media resources like the Gorilla Guide Book Club and the ATM Event Center. So I highly encourage you to access those resources now and share them with your friends and colleagues. Finally, at the end of this webinar, we'll be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky attendee on the live event. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for that prize. The official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the prize terms and conditions link there. Finally, at the end of this webinar event, we will be looking through all the questions that came in, and as if you needed an incentive to ask a question during an Ask Me Anything event. But we do have another $50 Amazon gift card that will go to the best audience question. So limber up those fingers and type in those questions because we want to see what you want to know. And so with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. So it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters today. We have Michael Wilcox, who's Chief Information Security Officer for the field at Stratascale, and John B. Murphy, who's Global Field Chief Security Officer and CISO at Rubrik. And let me bring John and Michael onto the screen. Gentlemen, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you being here today.
Glad to be here.
Hey, Same, Scott. Absolutely hey, great to be here.
So, Michael, let me turn to you quickly. Just, for those in the audience who don't know Stratascale, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the company and then sort of the way your role day to day involves ransomware, how you sort of interact with that.
Yeah, sure. So Stratascale is a wholly owned subsidiary of SHI. There may be some people on the Ask Me Anything today who are customers of SHI and know them. It's been a company that was founded in 1989 by Ty Lee. She is our owner and our fearless leader. And we've got about 5,000 employees and revenue that was just north of $12 billion last year. We're privately owned, and we are actually the largest woman and minority owned business in the United States, which we are very proud of. Now, Stratascale was founded November 6, 2020. So that is 524 days ago. Not that I'm counting, but what we do is we provide strategic services for Fortune 1000 and similarly structured companies. So what we really do is we help customers with strategy for digital transformation, cloud ascension, data intelligence, and automation. And cybersecurity is at the core of everything that we do. So what would you say you do here as far as my job? In a nutshell, you get the Office Space reference? In a nutshell, I work with executive leaders on improving their overall cybersecurity posture. And there's an awful lot that goes into that. And I'm sure we just want to jump right into the conversation and questions today. So I have provided, Scott was talking about the section where you can download things. There is a document, which is a PDF. And if anybody wants to learn more about Stratascale, get kind of an overview of our cybersecurity practice area, you can reference that document. There's some contact information in there. But regarding day-to-day responsibilities for ransomware, I have a lot of experience in that space, building out programs and centers of excellence to address integrity and availability of data with responsibilities around like incident response, disaster recovery, forensics, identity and access management, and GRC. So it's really about elevating conversations from that tactical level, which is also very important, but really trying to elevate it to create strategies to build resilient and secure architectures.
Okay, great. And John, same question to you. Just maybe just a brief overview of what Rubrik does, and then what your day-to-day responsibilities are like, and
Sure.
how
Yeah.
you how you face ransomware.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
It's going to pale in comparison to Michael's. I'll throw it up right now. Rubrik is an 8-year-old startup. So we were originally designed with a zero trust mentality back in 2013. So we made some very fundamental decisions when the product was designed that really positioned us well for today. And what I mean by that is a lot of the way that we designed the product was to say that you should be able to say that at any point in time, your data is secure and it's protected from the rest of the environment. Sometimes the decisions that you make early on in a startup bode very, very well. And in our case, it really has. So we're a data security company today. We start by securing your data at the lowest layer, and everything that you build on top of that from a cyber program perspective, from a business application perspective, then inherits all of that security and all of those guarantees about being resilient, being immutable, et cetera. But then we add a host of services on top of that, things like data discovery, your ability to look at the types of data that we see, look at alerts that we see in terms of what's happening to your data as it's archived on a daily or weekly or minute by minute basis, depending on how you want to set up your environment. And we've got a full stack of capabilities. In the handout section, I think there are several about our radar and sonar capabilities, essentially being able to, out of the box, discover about 60, 65 different types of sensitive data types that you may have in your environment. And those are great ways to feed back into the IT environment to say, we're seeing these things in the data that we're backing up, which means if our data is exposed somehow, the bad guys are probably seeing it as well. And so we're really providing a lot more actionable intelligence into the IT tier, beginning at the IT operations level and straight on through to the CISO level, as well as the security risk management functions and right onto the board. Brief thing about me, I've spent my career not working for vendors. I've actually worked for large companies my whole career. So spent about 20 years at ADP, and then have spent the last 15 or so years working in banks, global banks, Deutsche Bank and the Bank of New York, building out their cybersecurity programs, their cyber engineering programs. So I come at this from a very different perspective. I'm really looking at it from the question of how do we make the life of a CISO or a security team a little bit easier. And one thing that I'm sure that your guests have heard about or have experienced firsthand is cyber sprawl and the number of tools that you have in an environment. We aim to solve a lot of that problem by bringing together everything that you need to protect yourself from any kind of attack on your data, all into one set of applications, one platform that you can use to manage your data going forward. On a day-to-day basis, I typically work with our clients and our prospects. And as Michael pointed out, the hard work is the work that the first responders do on in any organization. Our work really is just making sure that it's clear to companies the type of value that they purchase from us and making the most of that. And also exposing them to some of the things that Rubrik does to help protect them should they be hit. We have a host of services that we provide. We aren't quite as wide as a full services organization, but we do provide a lot of services for organizations that do experience ransomware attacks.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, John, and thanks, Michael, for those. That's great background for us. And one more piece of background, I think, before we get into ransomware, which is, I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, is there on, why you two guys together? Why Stratascale and Rubrik together on this webinar? So, Michael, maybe I'll kick that one to you.
Sure. So it's pretty interesting because John and I have very similar backgrounds. And as we got to know each other, I'm dating myself a bit here. And John, I apologize because I'm going to date you a little bit too. But I actually started out at the age of 12. This was back in 1982, so you can do the math. And I started out on a Commodore VIC-20 computer. I was a programmer. I started with the basic programming language, got into assembly, but things got really interesting when I hooked up that computer to the phone and started to dial out and see what was out there. So that was fascinating. And John, you said you started out on a Timex Sinclair computer doing basic as well. And so when you talk about all the twists and turns that you've taken in your career, I've taken a lot of those as well. And I failed to mention at the beginning, but in terms of leadership roles, I was the CISO at Newell Brands, Newell Rubbermaid, and I built out the team from a team of one to a global team there over a period of 12 years. And then prior to joining Stratascale, I was the chief security executive at American Cancer Society, which is a cause near and dear to my heart. And I think, John, I don't want to speak for you, but I think really being here today is an indicator of just the partnership that we have between Rubrik, SHI, and Stratascale. And we just want to have a conversation here. I already see questions popping into the chat window there. And we just want to give some perspective. Some of this may be from kind of a leadership perspective. I'm not the kind of guy who's going to get into the weeds in terms of the nitty gritty, although I kind of like that stuff too. But I think just talking through this and sharing ideas on how to address ransomware is what we're all about today. John, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add.
No, I think you said it spot on. I mean, I think a lot of this is, number one, it's a community effort at this point, because ransomware actors are, quite honestly, they're well equipped to attack us all. And an attack on one is an attack on all of us in this case. So our partnership, I think, is a really good indicator of, sort of the thing that we're bringing to our clients, to this ecosystem, which is essentially, a view to say, you have to fight this problem. How you choose to fight this problem is up to you, what tools you select, et cetera. But you should be well armed with information and an understanding of how you would approach this from a strategy perspective.
Yeah, so let's talk about strategy, sort of strategic state setting on ransomware. And Michael, what's the problem with ransomware right now, and how is it evolving? How would you define the problem with the evolution
Well,
of it?
I remember the first time I saw a headline about ransomware, and this was a hospital that was on the West Coast, and they were hit back in 2016. They paid a ransom of 40 Bitcoin, which was around $17,000 a Bitcoin at the time. I really wish I had a time machine so I could go back and buy some, because it's just under 40 today. But that's the first time I actually saw an organization, and it was a hospital. And so I really paid attention to that. And as I kept my eyes on ransomware, I remember it was kind of like a spray and pray technique that attackers were using, because what they would do is they would prey on attackers. They would use email vectors, leverage email phishing campaigns as that primary attack vector to get their malware installed. And if somebody took the bait, whether it be your grandmother in Idaho or an employee in some big business, they'd collect a ransom, but the dollar amounts were really small compared to what we're seeing today. And I remember a couple years later, because I live in Atlanta, I came back from a trip and I landed at Hartsfield. I headed home and I was greeted by my lovely wife at the door, and she grabbed me and said, "We got to go watch TV. The city of Atlanta was just hit by a ransomware attack." And so I rolled my suitcase into the corner and we sat down to watch TV, and we watched everything unfold, not just that afternoon, but for the next couple of months. And at the time, the ransom had increased. They were actually asking for $51,000 for the recovery of the entire system. And I'm not suggesting that they should have paid the ransom. In fact, that with the government, that's probably not a viable solution. However, what ensued was publicly reported amounts of $17 million for the city to recover, and several weeks where couples couldn't get married because they couldn't get marriage licenses, and there were even prisoners that couldn't get checked into prison. And then if you fast forward to a couple of years past that, now we're seeing some really interesting things taking place, like double extortion attacks, which increased by 200% in 2020, which is basically like a double whammy, because ransomware attackers are not only encrypting data and demanding payment to make the data available, with an insidious twist, they're also gaining access to the systems first. They're getting a copy of the data, and then they're threatening to release it if the ransom's not paid. So the problem's twofold, because it deals with availability of the systems and the data, but also potential disclosure ramifications, which is a big threat if the ransom isn't paid. And then this one was really interesting too, with triple extortion. There were researchers that said the first case that they observed was with a Finnish psychotherapy clinic that was breached. And even after that clinic paid the ransom, the attackers threatened patients of the clinic with releasing their therapy notes. Now, do you remember Tony Soprano in The Sopranos? Well, it was a very sensitive matter for him to be seeing a psychiatrist. And there are some things that you just want to keep private, and physical and mental health are usually at the top of the list. And it just goes to the point that attackers are really thinking about those layers of complexity, the sensitivity of the data, and then they're exploiting it at multiple levels. And so they're upping their game because, in a nutshell, it's become very profitable from a financial standpoint.
John, this next strategic question I want to direct to you. Why is it over the last couple of years ransomware has become more of a boardroom issue involving, the CISO or the CIO?
So I think, in addition to everything Michael just talked about, because I think there's a lot of food for thought there. Ransomware has now become, for a lot of organizations, an existential threat, meaning that their very existence depends on how they handle the event. If they handle the event well, survival isn't necessarily guaranteed. And the problem that most organizations see is that they're subject to 2 and 3 subsequent attacks after that. I think it's risen to board level because it's now about not an attack on a technical function that the organization might have, but on its data. And the data is, at this point, the lifeblood of any organization. More and more, the challenge that we see with the global economy is that we don't transact in currency anymore. Transactions are done with data, and then settlement occurs after the fact. And so you input your credit card number to a website, you buy something, and you're paid, or that company is paid a couple of days later. So the fact that the data is now the real focus brings this discussion out of the realm of technology only and into the realm of business. So what are the impacts of a ransomware attack, from a reputational perspective, from a risk perspective, financially, brand recognition, regulatory, all those things now become board level discussions, because we are seeing some good things in the environment, certainly increasing regulation, increasing awareness around the importance of having control over your own data. PII is certainly a big topic in European countries. The US is evolving, but we're not quite there yet. But the fact that we're focusing more and more on the end user as the source of all this data and giving them control really does come down to being a good thing for organizations. It's a difficult time to manage through a ransomware event, because if you have personally identifiable information, if you have medical care information and it is exposed, well, then the organization itself is functionally responsible for what happens next with that. So in Michael's example, if someone were to suffer some type of a ramification because their medical data was exposed, the company that leaked the data, whether they did it on purpose or not, would be held responsible, because they are the ones who were the caretaker for that data. And I think that's why, more times than not, boards are getting very excited about ransomware and about, specifically what it could mean to them in the long run.
Yeah, and I just want to tack on there. I know personally for several years, I always really wanted that opportunity, if you can believe it, to get in front of the board of directors at some of my previous companies, but it didn't happen. Unfortunately, security doesn't get a lot of pats on the back or high fives for a job well done. And a quiet day is actually a pretty good day. But then something interesting happened. It was just around 10 years ago or so when we saw some of those high profile breaches that made major headlines, and we started to see the C-suite being ousted at those organizations. And all of a sudden, CISO started to get that tap on the shoulder to provide their updates. So it kind of speaks to that mantra, be careful what you ask for. You might just get it, because I've been asking to get that shoulder tap for years and years. And that's when we started to see that big lean in from the boards on cybersecurity. And we've seen this increase over the past few years for sure. All right. So if we put it plainly, a cybersecurity link that's weak can have very negative consequences to the business if they have an outage. And we're starting to see these CIOs and CISOs being invited to provide the updates because the board is looking at this gigantic pie of risk. And when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And from a security perspective, I admit it, I'm thinking about that world of cybersecurity risk, but the board is thinking about all sorts of other competitive risk and everything else. And they need to have those experts come to the table to provide to them that synopsis of what is being done to mitigate that specific risk. And a lot of us, we've been in security. We got close to 200 people here. There are so many different domains of security. You can go down so many different rabbit holes if you're talking about endpoint, if you're talking about firewalls, if you're talking about packet inspection, DLP, CASB. It's our job to not get into that world of 3 and 4 letter acronyms, but to talk in a language that they understand, which is the language of risk. And that's what they're really trying to do, is establish that level of trust with the CISO, that they have the right person at the helm, that they're guiding that ship in the right direction, and then they have a plan if and when something bad happens.
Michael, you mentioned the breaches of about a decade ago, really kind of kickstarting the board's interest in cybersecurity. Same question for you there. Like, what about on the ransomware side? What have been sort of the big sort of milestone incidents or the landmark incidents of the last few years that have maybe changed the way boardroom or at least, upper level executives have thought about ransomware or, affected the seriousness with which they took it?
I like to be careful and not call out specific companies. Let's just say, I remember one large entertainment company that did media production that got hit by North Korea. That was one of them. We had a large home product store that was hit. That was a pretty significant breach. And so that was a big one. But if we think about like last year in particular, there was a meat packing plant over in Brazil. I think it was JBS, and they got hit. That's overseas. And I think people started to look at that because the supply chain was really affected. And then we might talk about this a little bit more. I could just answer it right now, though, is the SolarWinds attack, right? Because at the end of 2020, that was like the Christmas white elephant gift that just kept on giving throughout calendar year 2021. And it gave all of these sleepless nights for incident response teams. CISOs found themselves having to try to deal with this in front of the board of directors. And the SolarWinds attack was a pretty significant one. And the most important thing about that one is that it leveraged the supply chain. And then if we get into the Kaseya attack last year as well, that was another example where attackers were able to compromise one particular entity, and they were a supplier of software that allowed you to do remote administration. So a lot of these smaller companies, like small and medium-sized businesses, they don't have a dedicated IT department. They don't have a dedicated security department. So they rely on managed service providers to do that for them. Well, they got into that software. And all of a sudden, like John was saying, some people didn't make it through that because their systems were affected and they were out for weeks. Bigger companies, they may be able to take that hit of millions of dollars, but smaller businesses, they can't take that hit. So when the systems are compromised and the data is encrypted, that's what we usually see as the really big headlines of the organizations that have the big brands behind them. But I would argue that it's a lot of the smaller companies who don't have dedicated personnel. They don't have good backup solutions in place already that are really feeling the major hits.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd echo that. I think you look at why is ransomware becoming such a hot topic now? I think part of it is because for years now, the firms that have been hit, the organizations that have been small, and they have not been, I want to say this the wrong way, They have not affected a lot of people. Meatpacking plants in the U.S. We had a distributor a utilities distributor who was hit last year, and that interrupted energy flow for the entire east coast of the country. The attacks are starting to get bigger and more impactful. While the number of attacks are decreasing over the last couple of years, the importance of each one of the attacks is increasing. And I think if you look at, even 5 years ago, I would say healthcare was absolutely getting hammered very, very badly by ransomware. Why? Well, partly because they have a lot of technology, and a lot of that technology is, IoT, Internet of Things kind of technology. So the number of places that an attacker could come at that organization is pretty wide. So if you think about, having 100 devices and there are problems with every device, there are always software issues or gaps, and you just multiply that by 1,000 devices, you suddenly see a much wider plane to be attacked. But the attacks were occurring, and they were small hospitals that were paying the ransom, not necessarily a lot of money, but money was being made. I think now the big challenge is, as the attacks go down and the impact goes up and expands, so that you've got the meatpacking industry, the oil and gas industry suddenly being impacted by these things, it becomes a much more widespread concern for everyone, because now it's to those of us who live it every day, it really is that existential threat that says, are we going to be able to recover what we do?
Yeah, and maybe one more question, sort of on the strategic side, but forward looking a little bit. But I know there was an executive order recently. Michael, in your view, is that going to change anything about the sort of the ransomware picture, or any other government action that's happening?
So optimistically, I'll say yes. If you build a cybersecurity word cloud for 2021, ransomware and supply chain would be two of the biggest words in that bubble. And John, you just talked about oil and gas. I think last year that was probably one of the biggest headlines because it affected so many people, and especially with the supply chain side. I was traveling, another travel story, but I was traveling and my wife told me that she wasn't able to get gas. It was actually the first time she used that Gas Buddy application. And then as soon as she filled up her SUV, they ran out of gas. So I was worried. Like I knew coming into Atlanta Hartsfield that I probably didn't have a lot of gas in my tank. So when I got in my car and I looked, it was down to about a quarter tank. And I know better than that because I grew up in Illinois and Wisconsin, and I never let it go below half a tank during the wintertime especially. But I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to get gas on the way home. So I stopped at gas stations. And as I pulled up into the gas stations, they looked like crime scenes. There was black and yellow tape everywhere, and there were orange cones all over the place. And I made it home, but I wasn't able to fill up. And fortunately for me, I was able to work remotely. A lot of us in IT can work remotely, but a lot of people couldn't get their kids to school. They couldn't get to work themselves, and the media really focused on that. I'm not saying they sensationalized it, but it really did get a lot of attention there. And then on the heels of that, because I was watching the news, that's when the Biden administration started to get involved. So specifically with Executive Order 14028, that was published in May last year under that title, Improving the Nation's Cybersecurity. It's like a 34-page document that has all these key points about supply chain improvement, getting a security review board, having a standard playbook, how to respond to incidents as well. But it also provides you some specific instruction how to detect different incidents on federal government networks. And so I've been keeping my eye on legislation because I think what's going to happen is we're going to see more stringent requirements around breach disclosure. We had this with GDPR, which was published May 25th, 2018. A lot of companies have been focused on that. But what we failed to have here in the States is a consistent message, because you have to look at the states, California, New York, what are the breach disclosure laws? And I think as they start to tighten the screws down on the suppliers to those governmental systems, it's going to have a ripple effect to the companies which provide those security products and services. And then the other part that's important about that is, As soon as we saw 14028, it said that NIST and CISA needed to start to create documentation. They've got great documentation. So they've been really proactive in creating documents, guidelines, and materials to assist in ransomware preparedness and resilience. And the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency actually has a website called stopransomware.gov. And it has steps to, number one, protect, number two, to prevent, and three, respond. And then NIST also has done some really good work. I know Rubrik does a fantastic job supporting zero trust initiatives. NIST has published document SP 800-207, and that addresses zero trust architecture, which we could spend hours just talking about that alone, but that's a really important paradigm which changes defenses from static network-based perimeters to focus on users, assets, and resources as well. So I think we need to keep our eyes on that legislation, and hopefully at some point we're going to see not really like a certification, but when you go and you get that Energy Star, when you buy a dishwasher or a refrigerator, if you can find them, I'm not saying we're going to get to the same level in security, but I think the government's going to start to influence organizations, and hopefully we'll be able to get some attestation that you meet some minimum level of security, which should instill a certain level of confidence.
Yeah, John, did you want to add anything to that, or?
No, what I think I wanted to get to is there is good news there as well, and I alluded to a little bit earlier. I think all of this focus, I talked about the focus on personally identifiable information a little bit. Now we're starting to see government agencies being restricted from using public funds to pay ransomware. We see that certainly school boards, who are also really hard hit by ransomware oftentimes. They're now seeing some of that same local legislation coming up and saying, you can't use your budget. If you're hit by ransomware, you can't pay the ransom. And so I think that's going to drive a lot of change in a positive way. If you think about dominoes falling in reverse, I think what we will see is, as we stop the ability for the organizations that get hit the hardest, the small organizations who don't have the big IT team, the defense in depth, and the huge budget to defend themselves, as they're stopped from using public funds, suddenly I think we're going to sort of see it in reverse and say, well, why did we have some of those gaps? And some of it may be underfunding. Some of it may be that those organizations should have dedicated more people to their cyber mission, or maybe there's other things that they should be doing, but that they didn't because they made a risk-based decision about needs at the time. So I'm optimistic that all of this visibility is really going to pay dividends a year out, 2 years out, as we start to look at what are the contributing factors to ransomware. I think underinvestment in IT is probably one of the things that gets us there. It's not the only problem, but certainly is one of them.
Okay. All right, great. Hey, well, I've been taking up your time with these sort of high-level questions, but this is an Ask Me Anything event, so let's maybe get into some of the audience questions here. The first one I wanted to get to was from Jim, who's asking, and this is something that this goes off something you guys were talking about earlier. Is it worth paying? I've seen where some ransomware organizations are run like a business with customer support, et cetera. Are there trustworthy, and he puts that in quotes, attacks where you can get your data back and not get it leaked? Is there any way to know what kind of organization you're dealing with, or and what's your view on paying versus not paying?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. I think the decision to pay or not to pay is entirely one that's going to be made inside the walls of the organization. What we typically see is that when you're attacked, if you have a reasonable understanding of the impact, then it's going to be pretty quickly about restoration of business as soon as possible. But it becomes a legal issue very, very quickly. Right. And so the legal team really is looking at it from lots of different angles, as are the risk teams and the executive management team. But I think the real challenge becomes trustworthiness of the attacker. And I don't think that you could argue that they are 100% trustworthy in any way, shape, or form. They're the attacker in this case. But if you look at the stats, most organizations that get hit again within 6 months. And the reason for that is the first group to attack them usually sells their intelligence, but what they learn, because their dwell time within the average organization is in excess of 70 days, they learn quite a bit about the organization. So they sell that. You'll be attacked again. For those organizations that pay, evidence is hard to come by. It's not like you're conducting a Gallup survey. But I think about 65% of organizations that pay are able to recover. And that is because they get the data that they get back is either incomplete, or the decryption keys don't work for everything, or they're missing some critical component that just wasn't returned to them. So I think it varies. I don't think there's a win-win for organizations. If you're going to pay, you're hoping that it's simply because that's your fastest path to getting back up and operating again.
And I think that's a really important conversation you were saying, John, about whether or not you're going to pay the ransom in the first place, because you could ask the question, does the CISO make the decision to pay the ransom? I certainly hope not. What we've usually seen is that it's the CEO, maybe it's a joint decision with the CFO, Chief Operations Officer, and the board. But I've read stories about CEOs who get that 5:30 a.m. call from their controller saying, we've got a ransomware outbreak and we really don't know what to do. And that's why I think it's really important to have things like tabletop simulations where you can bring those executives to the table and you can talk to them and ask that very important question. Would we pay the ransom? Because depending on the vertical that you're in, or if you're borderline government or in the government, you may not actually ever have the ability to pay the ransom. But what we've seen is a lot of organizations say, yeah, you know what? If IT has the inability to restore the data, we've got to punt. We've got to do something. And so you start to ask that question, well, should we pay the ransom? Now, before you get into like how you're going to pay it, you need to ask, is this particular attacking organization reputable? That's a dubious position at best, right? Because they are criminals. And let's not forget that they are criminals. And there have been many instances in the past historically where people would write software that would just change file extensions. And it looks like, oh my gosh, my files aren't there. It's not even encrypted. You change the file extensions back and you have access to your data. Or some cases where they're using weak encryption, and you can, if you have a relationship, and you should, I always say that you don't want to be trying to figure out who at the FBI to call the day that you can't get your systems up and running. Have a relationship with InfraGard and your special agent, build that relationship up with them, because in some cases you can actually say, look, we've got this issue. If your incident escalation procedures point to that, and they can come in and say, yes, we have tools. And we saw this with the oil company that you talked about before too, right? They were able to reclaim purportedly like over $2 million in the ransom money and get that back to the company. But there are things that you can do, like with the MITRE attack framework. And if you haven't looked at that, that's a great way to look at adversaries. So that is the adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. And when you do attribution, especially against certain verticals, like in the healthcare industry, which has fallen victim to a lot of ransomware attacks, you can actually say, well, this particular organization, they do have ransomware as a service set up. They probably have, Jim, you mentioned like that excellent customer service. They're responsive, but do you really want to pay the ransom? And if you do, you need to ask, do we have Bitcoin? I was in a meeting a couple weeks ago with some C-suite leaders that came up at the table. They all looked at each other and said, we don't know if we actually have Bitcoin or if we could get it. And so that's an action item, to get that, because it's not like you can go to Walgreens or the grocery store and actually get Bitcoin on a gift card, right? So that's a really good question. And then you just want to make sure that if you do pay the ransom, I don't know. I kind of personally take that stance of don't pay the ransom. So I'm kind of biased towards that. I'd want to exhaust all other efforts first and build up a proactive strategy to prevent it happening in the first place.
Okay, super. A lot of questions coming in here. One from Dirk was about how long does it take for ransomware payloads to activate? And John, I think you hit on that with the 70-day dwell time that we're seeing a lot. But one that I really liked for you guys in particular came from Michael. A lot of times there's sort of a disconnect between the IT security pros who really know the tech and what's happening in the boardroom and how to communicate effectively. And you guys spend a lot of time in boardrooms and you're there yourselves. So Michael's asking, what one piece of advice would you give in order to get the attention of the C-suite on the potential risks of ransomware? Would it be fact-based presentation on actual studies, or do you have any recommendations as far as that goes?
Yeah, I'll kick off. I think Michael hit on it. Tabletop exercises are probably the cheapest and most effective way to prepare for this type of event. And what I mean by that is, even if you can do a great understanding of a business impact just by reading an annual statement. You can come up with the scenarios that would likely cause you a great deal of pain, but would also give you lots of ammunition to go and have that conversation. So if you looked at, generally, what is revenue on a yearly basis, a monthly basis, a quarterly basis, and then just start to work inward to say, okay, at the time of an event, what would happen to our revenue stream if critical systems, one or two critical systems, were impacted? And that's where you sort of expand that conversation to get your business leaders involved to say, well, what are our most critical applications? And what are the ones that we would want to protect at all cost? But when you've got the factual data behind it, and you can talk about, well, an outage might cost us, $100,000 a day. Now you can start to have really good conversations with senior leadership, because that's something that is on top of everybody's mind. And if you're in a regulated industry, I think it gets even a little bit better, because now you can talk about, would we be subject to certain fines? If you're in New York State, as most financial firms are in the United States, New York State has a very aggressive Office of cybersecurity, and they would be very, very interested in finding out why the event happened to you. So you'd want to use all of those things to sort of build the case that, if left of boom is sort of where you want to be. So before the event happens, you have as much time to prepare worst case scenarios as possible, because that's really going to drive the board to say, okay, now I understand the business risk a little bit better, hopefully, if you're a good communicator and you're talking in the language of the board. And then I think then it becomes a discussion that's in business terms, risk terms, and it's quantified. And that gives you an incredible amount of credibility when you're having that conversation.
Yeah, I think the bottom line piece is really important, John, like you were saying. And if you speak that language of financial and reputational impact to the C-suite, they're absolutely going to understand it, because they may not understand the complexity of everything you need to do to be proactive in building resiliency, but they do understand the headlines. They do understand when they see other C-suite leaders being ousted from their organizations because they were hit, and they have a responsibility to listen and ask the right questions. So I think the tabletop simulations are a great way to do it. But I think also Michael's question talks about fact-based presentation. Within your vertical, it's also important, like I was talking about with that MITRE ATT&CK framework, are other people in your respective vertical being targeted? Because if so, you want to ramp up your defenses and you want to make sure that you're investing in the appropriate areas. You don't want a false sense of security that you've got a good security program. You want to identify those risks or those opportunities for improvement so that you can start to work on them. And then if you start to quantify it, there's a great report. It's published annually from IBM Security and the Ponemon Institute, and it's the cost of a data breach. So now you're speaking their language, because you can start to quantify what would it mean. And in the 2021 report, they had results that were combined from like 537 different organizations. For global companies, they went across 17 countries and regions. And the key finding was that the global average total cost of a data breach was $4.24 million. Okay, depending on your bottom line, that may or may not get their attention, but it's still a pretty significant dollar amount. And if we double click on that and we get down onto ransomware in that report, the report states that the average total cost of a ransomware breach was $4.62 million. Okay, this is not the $17,000, $20,000 I was talking about before. This is a sizable hit for a lot of organizations to their bottom line. But what I found really interesting about that is the costs included escalation, notification, the lost business and response cost, but didn't include the price of the ransom. And also, because that's an important point, it didn't include the cost of the ransom. But what we're really talking about is the fallout and the aftermath cost of dealing with the breach. But what about raising the bar? And you mentioned this before, John, that we're seeing companies get hit not once, but now it's a weak target. They paid the ransom. Let's hit them again. Let's hit them again. And so are they going to come back? So there are additional costs that you need to factor in terms of the reactionary steps to restore operations, and then also improving the overall security posture as well. So just talking about the likelihood that it could happen within your organization, whether or not you have a plan in place, and then what you are deciding to do to ramp up your security and reduce the likelihood of it occurring to your organization. And that's really the best of what we can do, is demonstrate measured progress over time where we keep ramping up our security programs. So get an audience with your board of directors, set up a steering committee, maybe give them some factual information, do a tabletop test, and it'll raise some awareness, and you'll have some rich conversations.
All right, great tips there. Thank you. Thanks for all that context there. That's really valuable. A lot of questions still coming in. We've got a couple here. I'll combine a couple from Christian and Jorge, who are both asking about, crypto, and are you guys hearing any discussions about, is there anything that can be done about cryptocurrency? Just, obviously it enables ransomware in such a fundamental way. I mean, there's been a massive scale up in ransomware attacks and the ability to take payments from cryptocurrency. Are there any measures in place that are, I don't know, legislation or anything that might be able to sort of put the cat back in the bag there, or is that just the way of things going forward? That there's always going to be that anonymous currency that makes it very difficult to track and stop.
So I'll just jump in. Oh, go ahead, John.
No, please. I think you have a better answer than I do.
Oh, I don't know about that, but I think that crypto space, it's just a really fascinating area, because when people started mining crypto a long time ago, it was just something you did. You got a GPU and you started mining crypto. We've actually seen targeted attacks within data centers where the attackers just want to use your power in processing, right? Because it's so electricity centric. They're actually getting into environments just so they can mine their own crypto. And then on the other side, we're seeing governments and whole nations start to put their toe in the water and say, we're going to accept Bitcoin. Elon Musk did it. For a while, you could actually pay for a Tesla with Bitcoin, and he invested billions of dollars in the company, or in Bitcoin technology. So I think over the next few years, we're going to start to see more attention being paid. But I know the big financial institutions are looking at trying to commoditize this, coming up with patents on their own. And the government also, they want traceability. And what we've seen with some of these attacks is they're doing covert operations, and they're getting in and understanding how that data is actually being transferred. So it's not as secret as you would think. They do have some ability to trace it, but I don't know if eliminating crypto would change the ransomware situation. It might diminish it a little bit, but they're going to find other ways to hold people hostage. And again, it comes back to, like we're seeing with double and triple threat extortion, maybe they're not asking you for Bitcoin outright, but they are going to threaten you in some way where they're going to affect your financial or your brand reputation.
Yeah. And I think where you ended on that is kind of where I would say as well. The form of payment is, I think, less of a problem than the fact that you have to pay. And I think that is ultimately the challenge that we need to solve, is if we're allowing organizations to handle these situations discreetly without reporting them, we're kind of blind to just how big the problem is. I've seen estimates that, total ransomware paid in 2019 was somewhere around 11 billion rather. And for 21, that number was 20 billion. Yes. I think that's only going to continue to go up as we, unless we have a lot of visibility to just how big this problem is. So I am not saying that every company has to report every event, but I think the more data we have, the better off we are, so that we're not paying the ransom. We're doing the things to get in front of the problem where we can. And that is a bigger problem for the actors than, let's say, the form of payment that we're making. Certainly, if you look at what's happened with Russia, getting them out of the SWIFT payment system has crippled a lot of what cryptocurrency has been doing from a ransomware perspective, payment perspective, that is. So that's not a long-term answer, right? So I find the form of payment is less of a concern than the fact that payment has to be made to begin with.
This next question comes from Ned, and I think this is one probably for John. Ned's asking, even if you pay the ransomware, can you truly trust the compromised data? Which, I guess that gets back into the dwell time issue, but also sort of immutable backup. So, what's your take on that?
Well, I think if you've got, so you mentioned immutability there, and I'll just talk on that for a second. If your backups are really immutable, then what we're concerned about here is not necessarily what they might be able to exfiltrate your data, but the fact that that data is exactly what you backed up, what you archived. So from that perspective, your systems of record should still be fine. They should still be consistent. But I think the second question you get into is, if you don't have that foundation of mutability, and you do go ahead and pay the ransom. I think I mentioned it before, but I think the number's like 65% of your data is what comes back to you. So 2/3 essentially is what you get back in terms of usable data. So you're out 1/3 of your data. Now, it depends on what that data is. Every company is going to be a little bit different, because the systems that get hit might be a little bit different in how you use them as well. But it becomes just a question of, okay, is that acceptable from an operational loss perspective? And can my business recover at that point if I don't have 100% restoration of the data at the point at which operations were interrupted?
Okay. All right, and I'm continuing to go through the questions are coming in almost faster than I can read them, which is fantastic, and I hope you guys will have an opportunity afterward to look over some of these questions and maybe get back to people offline, because there are so many great questions on here.
The system captures those, right, Matt? Because there are
it does.
A lot of good questions. Okay, good.
Yeah. Here's one from Tatiana, who's asking something, and I'll kick this back to Michael, because you made mention of this as well, and then maybe John, you might have some things to say about it too. But I was wondering, is there a playbook you could recommend for best practices on ransomware prevention?
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually a lot of great information. I'll start by saying Rubrik has some pretty good information, right? When I went out and I was looking at the website, you've got a white paper, which is called Best Practices Guide, Prepare and Recover from a Ransomware Attack, and that's a free download. That's a really good document. But I made reference to CISA, right? So with CISA, they have published a document. If you go to stopransomware.gov or CISA.gov, they really have a fantastic checklist. It's their best practices and response checklist. And there's a guide that walks you through several of those types of things that you would want to focus on. So that's really good. You also have, if you want to get into the technical weeds a little bit more, incident response is really what we're talking about here. I think making sure that you have a game plan, that motor memory for incident response and disaster recovery is key. And so NIST has a special publication, which is NIST 800-61, and that deals with computer incident handling. So as you're building your incident response plan, you want to make sure that you incorporate elements that specifically deal with it, and you want to look at your current state environment to identify any gaps that you might have, because it's a mile wide and an inch deep. I mean, you can talk about MFA, identity and access management. There are so many different things. A good corporate communication awareness program is certainly a piece that would go into it. And I think we focus too much on like phishing campaigns in some sense. They are very important, but let's use technology to stop those bad emails from even getting to the users in the first place. And those checklists will walk you through all of those types of things. And then as a last line of defense, and this is where Rubrik really shines here, is if you ever get to the point where you need to go out and restore your information, you have immutable backups that are encrypted. They're behind MFA. The whole architecture allows you to get down to file level restores, but that's your last line of defense. It's all the proactive things that you want to do ahead of it. So those are some really good things that you can look at. That's a top 3. I could go on and on about this. There's a lot of great resources, but check out the CISA ransomware guide. It's really good. That was published last year.
CISA ransomware guide. Fantastic.
Yep.
And Michael, we're going to send
go ahead.
you a Rubrik t-shirt. Sorry, I was just making a joke about sending Michael a Rubrik t-shirt. All of those things I think are absolutely critical. I think we talk a little bit about how to get ahead of the curve here, but most of our conversations unfortunately happen at the point at which you get hit. What I would say is that this starts with having an immutable backup, a way that guarantees that your data is exactly as it was when you wrote it, and you've got the ability to say that not only is that immutable, but it's also off of your production network, protected by MFA, as Michael just suggested, and that you're constantly looking at that data for signs of potential infiltration or potential, either malicious or accidental deletions. And that's where we strive to be. Right? We're that foundation upon which everything else is built. I think that's probably the place that I would spend the most time from an IT operations, a cyber security operations perspective at this point, is making sure that we can always tie ourselves back to a system of record that we know is immutable and is not subject to being another share on the network somewhere that someone could potentially access if they were able to infiltrate and then start to move around your organization over time. It really comes down to getting ahead of the problem before it ever becomes a problem. And it also opens up the door to a number of other things. And I think we've all seen this. For the best of intentions, organizations always make decisions around what they do with their data, how they manage it. Sometimes you might find that you are handling credit card data, as an example, but that data isn't encrypted in your own files, in your own repositories. We can tell you that. And we see that before that ever becomes an issue. And that goes back and just that's feedback to the IT teams, to the business teams, to say, look at this from a priority perspective. If that data was exposed and we can see it, we know that the bad guys can see it as well. Therefore, taking some time and making that the priority saves us, because if the data is exfiltrated, they will not be able to see what it is, and they won't be able to use it in extortion against us or potential clients or anyone else. And that avoids the regulatory fines as well. GDPR is a very, very heavy sword. And 4% of global revenue is the potential fine for any organization that exposes PII. And they don't look at it as a simple thing to say, well, we just didn't invest the right way, and apologies, we'll do better next time. You don't get out of jail very easily when you're held to that kind of a standard. So I think that's an important thing to note, is we do have time. Before boom happens, you want to be well positioned to say that your data is protected, even if it was exfiltrated.
Well, that's probably a pretty good place to leave it. Did you have any sort of closing thoughts, or did you want to leave it at that? Because that was pretty well put.
I just wish we had another hour, because I think we could keep this conversation going. There's so many great questions. Apologies that we weren't able to get to them all. We'll try to capture them and respond in some way. But I think one of my personal favorite mantras is, in IT security, we're all smart, but none of us is as smart as all of us. And I think having sessions like this and just talking through it, being able to answer conversations and brainstorm is really important. And I know when I got into the cybersecurity space, I was just kind of this cybersecurity nerd. My wife and I talk about how great that's worked out over the years. I have a lot of respect for everybody in cybersecurity. So thank you for the work that you're doing. And this is really important work, and it keeps us on our toes. So let's keep learning and talking about this stuff. And we appreciate your attendance.
Yes. Well said.
All right. Well, Michael Wilcox, John Murphy, thank you both so much for being on. Great insights. Appreciate all your answers to the questions, and also thank you in advance for any questions that you can answer for our audience post event. I'm sure they'd appreciate it as well. And with that, I do want to do one more quick reminder about that handout section. There are several Rubrik and Stratascale resources in there. We're about to wrap up here in a minute, so if you were interested in those, please grab them now. And with that, I'm gonna say so long to John and Michael. Thank you both so much for being on, and we'll head on to the prize portion. So thanks, gentlemen.
Thanks all.
Okay, and we do have the $300 Amazon gift card to give away here, and the winner of the gift card is Christian Rodriguez from North Carolina. So congratulations to Christian. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Rubrik and Stratascale for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for all of your questions. And I mean, especially all of your questions today. This has been fantastic. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. But that concludes today's event. Have a great rest of your day.